I've encountered many strange things in my life, but what happened that night, in that house, is something that changed the way I see the world, and I still don't know whether I survived it or became part of it. It all began with an innocent invitation. A longtime friend, an enthusiast of the occult, invited me to spend the weekend at an isolated place. It was supposed to be a retreat, a chance to escape the chaos of everyday life. But what he didn't tell me was that the house wasn't just isolated, it was waiting. We arrived just as the sun was beginning to dip behind the mountains. The house, an old iron and wood structure, stood alone on a patch of land far from any other residence. I'd heard rumors about it. A family had vanished mysteriously years ago, leaving no trace. But I wasn't the superstitious type. I thought it would be the perfect setting for a news story. A bit of research, maybe a touch of inspiration for my next book. But nothing could prepare me for what awaited. The moment we entered, I noticed the smell, something metallic and damp, like the house had been locked away from the world for far too long, suffocating beneath layers of dust. The air was heavy, oppressive, thick with time. The windows, covered by thick velvet curtains, let no light in. The only light came from the candles my friend, excitedly, had lit all over the room. And the sound was unbearable. A constant, faint buzzing noise like the house itself was whispering something we couldn't understand. Night fell quickly. The wind began to pick up, tapping against the windows, and my friend started telling stories about the place. He spoke of the family that had once lived there, of strange rituals they had been rumored to perform. The place wasn't just abandoned, he said, it was cursed. I chuckled, of course. I've heard these stories 1,000 times. But then he did something I will never forget. He lit a circle of candles in the middle of the room and began whispering in a language I didn't recognize. That's when it started. A distant sound, like footsteps, came from upstairs. I tried to ignore it, brushing it off as the house settling, but my friend turned to me, wide-eyed. "Did you hear that?" he asked, his voice trembling. We moved upstairs. The hallway was dark, musty, the air thick with the smell of mildew. The doors to the rooms were ajar, and with each step, the pressure on my chest grew heavier, like something was pressing against me, suffocating me. The footsteps, at first faint, were now unmistakable. It was as if something was walking just out of sight, moving behind the walls, around corners, following us. When we reached the last door, what we found didn't make any sense. The room was empty, except for an old iron chair positioned directly in front of a window. But what struck me immediately was the impression of someone sitting there, as though an invisible figure had just gotten up. I walked toward the chair, instinctively touching the seat, and felt an unnatural chill shoot down my spine. But what happened next? I can't explain. The candles downstairs began to extinguish one by one, and a soft, guttural murmur rose from the walls, growing louder, closer. Something was circling us, surrounding us. Something alive. "We need to get out of here," I said, my voice tight. But as we turned to leave the room, the footsteps, which had been distant, now seemed to be directly behind us. I looked at my friend, and his face was pale, his eyes locked onto something down the hallway. I followed his gaze, and I saw it too. A dark figure, an outline of shadows, standing at the far end of the corridor. It didn't move. It just watched us. Then, before I could react, the house trembled. The floor beneath us seemed to shift and buckle as if it were alive, threatening to swallow us whole. We ran. We rushed down the stairs, but when we reached the landing, I saw something that froze my blood. The door at the end of the hall slammed shut, violently. The air grew cold, unbearable, like the house itself was trying to trap us. And then I heard it. A voice, so faint at first that I thought I was imagining it. But it wasn't in my head. It was in the walls. Stay with us." My friend grabbed my arm. "We have to go now." Now. But as we tried to leave, I noticed something terrifying. The front door, which had been wide open when we arrived, was now closed. It was locked. We were trapped. The figure was closer now. I could feel it. I could almost hear its breathing. In a panic, we broke through a side window and ran into the cold night air, heart pounding in our chests. But when I looked back, the house was different. What had once been a familiar, decaying structure now looked warped. Its windows were misshapen, its doors bent and twisted, as if time had bent to its will. And there, in one of the upstairs windows, the figure stood, watching. When we made it to the safety of the car, I glanced back once more. The house was still there, but it was no longer just a house. It was something more. Something that would never let go. Something waiting. To this day, I don't know what happened. But I do know this: the house was alive. It was waiting for us to leave, but it never truly wanted us to go. And I've never been able to fully escape it. No matter how far I run, no matter how many years pass, something in that house still calls to me. And sometimes, late at night, I hear it, quiet whispers far away, as if the house is still calling my name. I always considered myself a rational person. I grew up believing that fear was just a chemical reaction of the body to unfamiliar situations, a response from the brain when it couldn't comprehend something. But one night, when I found myself in a secluded cabin, far from any help or communication, something happened that defied all my understanding of the world. And to this day, I still wonder if it really happened, or if my mind, pressured by isolation and darkness, created the whole experience. It was a weekend I planned to escape the chaos of the city, renting a cabin in a rural area. The place seemed perfect, quiet, peaceful, and an opportunity to get away from the pressures of everyday life. What I didn't know was that the cabin had a dark past, something I wouldn't discover until later, when I started looking into what was happening. The cabin, though old, was well maintained. It had 2 floors, with large windows offering a clear view of the dense forest that surrounded the place. I was alone, as I liked it, with my laptop, some books, and a bottle of wine. The plan was to spend a quiet night, enjoying the solitude I craved. Little did I know, that cabin had something waiting for me, something I couldn't understand. The night fell quickly, and it was an overcast evening with no moon. The darkness seemed to engulf everything. The cabin felt even older than I imagined as the hours passed. There was something in the air, something about the environment, that made the place uncomfortable. It wasn't a specific sound, but a growing feeling that something was wrong. A pressure, like the house itself, was watching me, waiting. I tried to ignore it and focused on my laptop. Then I heard it. A sound, soft and almost imperceptible, but it was there. Something like a whisper coming from somewhere inside the cabin. I put down my work and glanced around. The windows were shut, and the door was locked. There was nothing out of the ordinary. I thought it might have been the wind or perhaps the old house creaking. But as the sound grew, it became clearer, more distinct. It seemed to be coming from one of the rooms upstairs. I hesitated. My mind raced for a logical explanation. Maybe I was hearing things. Maybe the house, being old, had its quirks. But somehow, I knew that the sound wasn't coming from the house. It wasn't natural. Something in my skin, in my spine, told me I shouldn't go upstairs. I went back to the living room, trying to calm myself. The sound stopped, but the feeling of being watched never left. The air was thick, like each breath I took was an effort. Every shadow on the wall seemed to move slowly, as if it was shifting, changing shape. I knew this couldn't be real, but the fear began to take hold. Finally, I decided to go upstairs. I had to know what was happening, what was making the sound. The stairs creaked with every step, and each one seemed louder than the last, echoing through the empty house. I was hyper-aware, feeling as though someone, was about to appear. When I reached the landing, the hallway in front of me was dark, even darker than it should have been. The doors to the rooms were closed, but one door in particular caught my attention. It was slightly open. The voice was coming from inside. "Come here!" The words were whispered in a tone that made my heart skip a beat. With my heart racing, I pushed the door open slowly. And there it was, standing in the middle of the room, a figure, shrouded in a dark mist, standing near a broken window. But it wasn't a person. It was more like a shape, an indistinct silhouette, made of shadows and darkness. It had no face, but it had a presence. A feeling that it was watching me, that it knew exactly where I was, knew exactly what I was feeling. The terror I felt was indescribable. Every cell in my body screamed to run, but something kept me frozen. I couldn't tear my eyes away from it. I knew that if I looked away, something terrible would happen. Then the figure moved. It moved in a way that was almost supernatural. The air in the room grew colder as it moved closer. The temperature dropped sharply, and I felt as if death itself was standing right next to me. I didn't know what to do. Every part of my body was paralyzed by fear. The figure came closer, until it was just inches away from me, and then, in a voice that echoed directly into my ear, it whispered, "You've seen me now." With a scream, I fell to the floor. When I regained my senses, the house was completely silent again. Everything was as it had been before. The doors were open, and the broken window had been repaired. But something had changed. I was no longer alone. Something was still watching me. When I left the cabin the next morning, my heart was still racing, and the feeling of being followed never left. What happened in that cabin could never be explained. I never knew if it was real or if my mind cracked under the isolation. But every time I close my eyes, the voice returns. And the worst part is, I know that something in the darkness is waiting. Now every time I hear a whisper in an empty house, I know not to ignore it. Because something, or someone, may be waiting to say, "Now you've seen me." The Gift. A true horror story. I've always been a skeptic when it comes to the supernatural. As a writer, my mind is more inclined to logic, to the things that can be explained, dissected, and rationalized. But everything changed on the night my friend Daniel gave me that cursed gift. It was my birthday, and Daniel showed up with a small package wrapped in brown craft paper. His smile, usually wide and full of mischief, seemed off that day. There was something about him, a subtle unease that I couldn't place. He handed me the gift with an odd look in his eyes, like he was hiding something. "Go ahead, open it," he said, his voice a little too eager. "You'll like it." Inside the package was a small wooden box, intricately carved with strange, twisting patterns. The wood was dark, almost black, like it had aged for centuries. There was no tag, no clue as to where it came from or who had made it. I opened the lid slowly, feeling a strange sense of foreboding. Inside, resting on a bed of velvet, was a silver medallion, its centerpiece a deep green stone encircled by a pattern of snakes coiled around it. I glanced up at Daniel, expecting an explanation. He just stood there, his eyes darting nervously away from mine. "It's a special gift," he murmured, almost as if the words pained him to say. I raised an eyebrow. "It's a little old, don't you think?" He shrugged, forcing a smile. "Don't overthink it, man. It's just a gift." I tried to push aside my growing discomfort. I didn't want to seem ungrateful, so I slipped the medallion over my neck, and for a moment, everything felt normal. But something was off. A heavy weight settled on my shoulders, like a shadow following me. The party continued, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. That night, when I got home, I noticed the apartment felt quieter than usual. The walls seemed to press in on me, the air heavier, thicker. The medallion, which I had hardly noticed before, now seemed to burn against my skin. I tried to ignore it, convinced I was just tired from the long day, but I couldn't. Over the next few days, I began to notice small things. The house was too quiet, no creaks or shifts of the old floorboards. There were sounds I couldn't explain, faint knocks on the walls, whispers I thought I heard just at the edge of my hearing. I tried to chalk it up to my imagination, but then I started seeing things. I'd walk past mirrors, and for a split second, I'd swear I saw something behind me, just a flash, a shadow. But when I turned around, there was nothing. I'd be sitting on the couch, writing, and out of the corner of my eye, I'd see movement, figures, walking slowly, just out of my field of vision, standing in the doorway or at the edge of the hallway. I couldn't explain it. I could never explain it. And then, one night, the horrors began. I had just finished writing for the night and was sitting in the living room, scrolling through my phone, when I heard the footsteps. Slow, dragging steps, like someone was stumbling through the hallway. My heart leaped into my throat. I turned my head toward the door, but nothing was there. I stood up, my hands shaking, and walked cautiously toward the hall. The medallion felt like it was burning now, almost too hot against my chest. My breath was shallow, my chest tight. The house was silent, save for the faintest scratching noise coming from behind the walls, as though something was trying to claw its way through. I opened the door to the hallway, expecting nothing more than an empty space. But as I passed by the mirror in the foyer, I froze. There, standing just behind me, was a figure. At first I thought it was my reflection, but no, it wasn't me. A tall figure, cloaked in black, with a pale face twisted into a grotesque mask. The eyes were black, empty voids that seemed to swallow all light. I spun around, but no one was there. The figure in the mirror was gone. I looked again, but now it was just my own reflection, staring back at me. I don't know how I did it, but I ran out of the house, not even locking the door behind me. The cool night air didn't help the suffocating sense of dread that gripped me. The whole night, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. It wasn't until I returned home hours later, too scared to stay out any longer, that I realized the true horror. When I stepped inside, the silence had returned, but it was unnerving. It was too quiet. I glanced at the mirrors. Something was different. In each reflection, I saw the same thing, myself, but not the same. The shadows around me were darker, shifting, twisting in unnatural ways. And there, standing just behind me in the corner of the living room, was the figure again. It was taller now, closer. Its cold, black eyes fixed on me, and then I heard the voice. It came from behind me, soft, whispering, but clear. "You shouldn't have accepted the gift." I spun around, but the room was empty. I felt paralyzed, unable to breathe, unable to move. My heart hammered in my chest as the air in the room grew colder, and the shadows seemed to grow longer, reaching for me. I tried to run, but my legs wouldn't move. I couldn't leave. The weight around my neck was suffocating. The medallion burned, and it seemed to draw me back to it. The shadows seemed to close in on me, and I could hear footsteps again, slow, dragging steps, growing louder as they came closer. And then I heard that voice again, this time closer, right behind me. "You belong to us now." In a panic, I tore the medallion from my neck, but the moment I did, everything went black. I woke up hours later on the floor of my living room, the medallion cold in my hand. The shadows were gone. The house was silent. I tried to rationalize it, to tell myself it had all been a nightmare. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. That the presence had stayed. Daniel disappeared soon after that night. When I tried calling him, his phone went straight to voicemail. I even visited his apartment, but no one was there. His neighbors hadn't seen him in days. It was as if he had vanished without a trace. I never put the medallion back on, but the feeling never left me. I still see those shadows sometimes, lurking just outside my vision. I hear the whispers when I'm alone, soft, insistent, calling my name. And every time I pass a mirror, I feel them watching me, waiting. And sometimes, when I think I'm alone in my apartment, I'll hear it, the dragging footsteps, getting closer. So, if anyone ever offers you a gift like mine, don't take it. Don't accept anything from anyone without knowing where it came from. Because some gifts, they don't come with just a ribbon. They come with a price, and you'll never escape.